Before we begin, if you enjoy tales of absurdity, historical mishaps, and the occasional spoon-related humiliation, consider subscribing to Nightfall Notions for more delightfully boring bedtime stories. Now settle in as we delve into the first chapter of our tale. The Spoon Night Rises. Sir Reginald the Unprepared was not, by any stretch of the imagination, a man cut out for knighthood. He had the unfortunate habit of misplacing his sword, forgetting his armor, and, on one particularly memorable occasion, arriving at a jousting tournament with his helmet on backward. But even by his own abysmal standards, the day he brought a spoon to a sword fight was a new low. It had all begun with a challenge, a duel of honor, no less. The pompous Lord Cedric of Blackmoor had taken offense to an offhand remark Reginald had made about the questionable lineage of Cedric's prized hunting hound. The words "overgrown rat" may have been uttered, though Reginald insisted it was all in good fun. Regardless, Cedric demanded satisfaction, and the terms were set. Dawn at the tourney fields, blades drawn, honor at stake. Reginald, ever the optimist, spent the evening before the duel in high spirits. He regaled the tavern patrons with tales of his, entirely fictional, combat prowess, downed several flagons of ale, and retired to his chambers with the vague notion that he ought to prepare. Preparation, however, was not Sir Reginald's strong suit. He stumbled about his room, tripping over a discarded boot and knocking his sword from its perch on the wall. With a clatter, it slid beneath his bed, and Reginald, in a stroke of genius, decided it would be easier to retrieve in the morning. Dawn arrived with all the subtlety of a cymbal crash. Reginald lurched upright, his head pounding, and squinted at the pale light creeping through his window. The duel. Right. He scrambled to dress, cursing as he tangled himself in his own surcoat. His gauntlets were missing, likely pilfered by the tavern cat, and his helmet, when he finally located it, still bore the dent from last week's ill-advised attempt to juggle it. Then came the matter of his weapon. Reginald dropped to his knees, groping beneath the bed for his sword. His fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. "Ah!" he exclaimed, seizing it triumphantly. Only when he stood did he realize his error. It was not his sword. It was a spoon. A large utilitarian serving spoon, the kind one might use to ladle soup, or, in a pinch, stir a very large pot of something dubious. Reginald stared at it. The spoon stared back. Outside, a herald's horn blared. There was no time. With a sigh that spoke volumes about his life choices, Reginald tucked the spoon into his belt and strode out to meet his fate. The tourney fields were already crowded with onlookers, eager for bloodshed. Lord Cedric stood at the center, resplendent in polished armor, his sword gleaming in the morning light. He took one look at Reginald, noted the absence of a proper weapon, and burst into laughter so loud it startled a nearby flock of pigeons into panicked flight. "By the gods," Cedric wheezed, wiping tears from his eyes. "Have you come to duel me or serve pudding?" Reginald, to his credit, did not falter. He drew the spoon with all the gravitas of a man unsheathing Excalibur. "This," he declared, "is a spoon of justice." The crowd erupted. Some cheered. Others groaned. A few began placing bets on how long he would last. Cedric, still chuckling, assumed his stance. "Very well, Spoon Knight. Let us see how you fare." What followed was less a duel, and more a tragicomic ballet of clattering metal and desperate improvisation. Reginald parried Cedric's first strike with the bowl of the spoon, the impact sending a reverberating clang across the field. He sidestepped the next blow, using the spoon's handle to hook Cedric's ankle and send him stumbling. For a brief, glorious moment, it almost seemed like Reginald might win. Then reality reasserted itself. Cedric, red-faced with humiliation, swung wildly. The spoon, valiant though it was no match for tempered steel. With a decisive cracking, it split in two, leaving Reginald holding a jagged stump. Silence fell. Reginald looked at the broken spoon, then at Cedric, then back at the spoon. "Well," he said, that could have gone better. The crowd, now thoroughly invested, waited with bated breath. Would Cedric strike him down? Demand surrender? Laugh himself into a stupor? What happened next was unexpected. Cedric lowered his sword. He studied Reginald for a long moment, then sighed. "You're an idiot," he said. "But you're a brave idiot. I can respect that." And just like that, the duel was over. No bloodshed. No vengeance. Just two men, one holding a broken spoon, the other shaking his head in bewildered admiration. As Reginald trudged back to the tavern, the crowd parting before him, he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of accomplishment. He had faced certain death armed with nothing but cutlery, and he had lived to tell the tale. And so began the legend of Sir Reginald the Unprepared, the Spoon Knight. His journey, as it turned out, was only just beginning. Chapter 2. A Nobleman's Misguided Training. To understand how a man like Sir Reginald could arrive at adulthood believing a spoon was an acceptable dueling weapon, one must first examine his upbringing, a saga of well-intentioned absurdity and pedagogical malpractice that could only have occurred in the halls of the aristocracy. Reginald was born the third son of Lord Percival of Hollisha, a man whose primary concerns in life were maintaining an impeccable wine cellar and ensuring no one ever caught him wearing the same doublet twice. Percival's estate was a place of strict decorum, where even the hounds were trained to curtsy before begging for scraps. It was, in short, the worst possible environment for a boy who would one day be expected to wield a sword without accidentally impaling himself. From the moment Reginald could hold a utensil without dropping it, his education was entrusted to a series of tutors, each more eccentric than the last. First came Master Alaric, a retired herald whose sole qualification was an encyclopedic knowledge of which fork to use when eating peacock. Under his tutelage, Reginald learned to distinguish between a fish knife and a butter knife before he could reliably tie his own shoes. Then there was Dame Winifred, a formidable woman who had once been the Queen's personal etiquette instructor. She drilled into young Reginald the importance of posture, the art of the deferential nod, and the proper way to sip soup without slurping. By the age of 8, he could balance a stack of books on his head while reciting the 7 deadly sins of table manners. Swordplay, however, was conspicuously absent from the curriculum. When Lord Percival finally noticed that his son couldn't so much as lift a practice blade without getting tangled in the scabbard, he summoned a fencing master, a grizzled veteran named Sir Godfrey, who had allegedly fought in 12 battles and lost count of how many men he'd killed. Unfortunately, Sir Godfrey had also lost count of how many ales he'd consumed that morning. His idea of instruction involved waving a sword in the general direction of the training dummy while muttering about the good old days. Reginald, ever eager to please, tried his best. He mimicked Sir Godfrey's unsteady stance, copied his haphazard swings, and even adopted his habit of pausing mid-drill to belch thoughtfully. After a particularly disastrous session in which Reginald managed to knock himself unconscious with his own wooden sword, Sir Godfrey declared him a hopeless case and resigned, citing an urgent need to be somewhere less embarrassing. With no other options, Lord Percival did what any nobleman would do. He outsourced the problem. Enter Brother Thaddeus, a monk from the nearby abbey who had taken a vow of silence, a vow he broke only to criticize Reginald's footwork. Thaddeus believed combat should be a spiritual exercise, a dance of discipline and restraint. This philosophy might have worked had Reginald possessed even a shred of coordination. Instead, their lessons devolved into a series of meditative poses interrupted by the occasional yelp as Reginald tripped over his own feet. The final nail in the coffin of Reginald's martial education came in the form of Lady Isolde, his father's new wife, a woman whose idea of warfare involved strategically deploying gossip at dinner parties. She insisted that brute strength was outdated, that true power lay in the subtle art of influence. Why swing a sword, she mused, when you can ruin a man with a well-placed rumor about his wife's hat? Under her guidance, Reginald became adept at backhanded compliments and withering glances. His ability to stab someone with a dagger, however, remained woefully underdeveloped. By the time Reginald reached adulthood, his education had left him with a peculiar set of skills. He could identify 7 different types of napkin fold, recite the lineage of every noble house in the kingdom, and extricate himself from awkward conversations with breathtaking finesse. But when handed a sword, he regarded it with the same confusion as a cat presented with a doorknob. It was no surprise, then, that when the moment came to defend his honor against Lord Cedric, Reginald's instincts led him not to the blade on his wall, a weapon he had never learned to use, but to the spoon on his nightstand, an instrument he understood intimately. In his world, spoons were reliable. They had never betrayed him, never left him humiliated in front of his peers. If he was to face death, he would do it with a utensil he trusted. And so, armed with nothing but a lifetime of misplaced priorities and a steadfast belief in the power of cutlery, Sir Reginald the Unprepared strode onto the tourney fields. Later, as he picked splinters of spoon out of his sleeve, he reflected that perhaps, just perhaps, his upbringing had not prepared him for the realities of knighthood. But then again, he mused, who needed swords when you had impeccable table manners? The world, as it turned out, disagreed. But that was a lesson for another day. Chapter 3. The day of the duel dawns. The morning of the duel arrived with a quiet indifference to Sir Reginald's fate. The sun rose as it always did, casting golden fingers of light through the grimy window of the tavern where Reginald had spent the night. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster crowed, sounding less like a herald of dawn, and more like a creature that had just realized it too would one day end up in a stew. Reginald, however, was in remarkably high spirits. He had slept deeply, and without dreams, blissfully unaware that this would be the last morning of his life, in which he was not known as the Spoon Knight. Stretching with a yawn that would have made a hibernating bear proud, he swung his legs off the cot and immediately stepped on a discarded tankard. The resulting clatter startled a mouse, which shot across the floor with a reproachful squeak. "Good morning to you as well," Reginald muttered, shaking out his foot. The tavern's common room was already half full of early risers, merchants breaking their fast before the market, laborers gulping down lukewarm ale to numb the day's coming aches, and at least one elderly man who appeared to be conducting a spirited debate with a loaf of bread. Reginald took a seat at a corner table and waved for the serving girl. "Porridge," he announced grandly, "and whatever passes for bacon in this fine establishment. And ale, a lot of ale." The girl, whose name was Molly and whose patience for nobles was at an all-time low, gave him a look that suggested she was mentally calculating how much force it would take to dump the porridge directly onto his head. Still, business was business, and so she trudged off, returning moments later with a wooden bowl of lumpy gruel, a strip of something that might once have been pork, and a tankard of ale so dark it could have doubled as ink. Reginald, ever the optimist, beamed as if presented with a royal feast. He reached into his belt and withdrew his most trusted companion, his spoon. It was a simple thing, unadorned, its handle worn smooth from years of use. To Reginald, it was more than a utensil. It was a steadfast ally in the daily battle against hunger. As he dug into the porridge with the enthusiasm of a man who had never once considered that this might be his last meal, the tavern door creaked open, admitting a gust of wind and a familiar figure. Gawain, Reginald's squire, or at least the closest thing he had to one. Gawain was a wiry youth with a perpetually harried expression, as if he had been born mid-sprint and had never quite stopped. "Milord," Gawain gasped, skidding to a halt beside the table. "You're still eating?" Reginald paused, spoon halfway to his mouth. "Yes, it's breakfast time. The duel, milord. The duel is at dawn." Reginald glanced out the window, where the sun had now climbed high enough to confirm that dawn had come and gone like a discreet thief. He swallowed a mouthful of porridge. Gawain's eye twitched. "Lord Cedric is already at the tourney fields. He's been waiting. He's not happy." Reginald considered this. Then he took another bite. "Well, he shouldn't have challenged me before breakfast. Rude." Gawain made a noise that was not quite a scream, but was certainly in the same family. "My lord, you can't just—" He flapped his hands in a manner that suggested he was trying to conjure words out of the air. "You have to go, now." Reginald sighed. He scraped the last of the porridge from the bowl, licked the spoon clean with a solemn reverence, and tucked it back into his belt. "Very well, let's get this over with." Outside, the streets were bustling. Word of the duel had spread, and the good people of Hollowshire were not about to miss a free spectacle. They parted as Reginald strode past, some offering encouraging nods, others murmuring bets under their breath. A few children trailed after him, giggling at the way his scabbard kept bumping against his legs. At the edge of the tourney fields, the crowd thickened. A makeshift arena had formed, a loose circle of spectators whose collective breath hung in the crisp morning air. At its center stood Lord Cedric, resplendent in gleaming armor, his sword resting point down in the dirt. His expression was the kind of furious calm, usually reserved for men who were one misplaced comma away from burning down a monastery. Reginald, blissfully oblivious to the tension, raised a hand in greeting. "Cedric, lovely morning for a scrap, isn't it?" Cedric's jaw tightened. "You're late." "Fashionably so," Reginald agreed. He patted his belt, then frowned. "Ah, forgot my sword." A collective groan rose from the crowd. Cedric closed his eyes, visibly counting to some high, saintly number. When he opened them again, they burned with the intensity of a man who had just realized he was about to duel an actual fool. "You forgot your sword." "Yes, bit of a hiccup, really." Reginald glanced around as if hoping a spare blade might materialize from the ether. When none did, he shrugged and reached for the only weapon he had, the spoon. The crowd fell silent. Cedric stared. "Is that a spoon?" Reginald brandished it with a flourish. "Indeed it is. Fine craftsmanship, don't you think?" For a long, terrible moment, no one moved. Then Cedric burst out laughing. It was not a kind laugh. It was the laugh of a man who had just realized the universe had handed him a gift wrapped in absurdity. "By all means," he wheezed, wiping his eyes, "let's see how you fare." And so, as the sun climbed higher and the crowd leaned in, Sir Reginald the Unprepared squared off against Lord Cedric of Blackmore, armed with nothing but a spoon and the unshakable confidence of a man who had never once considered the possibility of failure. It was, as history would later record, not his finest hour. Chapter 4. The gasps of the crowd. The moment Sir Reginald drew his spoon, the world seemed to pause in collective disbelief. Time itself hesitated, as if unsure whether to proceed with such an unprecedented breach of martial decorum. The assembled crowd, composed of knights, merchants, peasants, and at least one overly enthusiastic pickpocket, froze in a tableau of astonishment. Mouths hung open. Eyebrows climbed toward hairlines. A small child dropped his sausage, which was immediately snatched by an opportunistic hound that would later regret its life choices. Lord Cedric's laughter had cut off abruptly, replaced by the wide-eyed stare of a man questioning whether he'd somehow stumbled into a fever dream. His gauntleted fingers flexed around the hilt of his sword as if hoping it might provide some anchor to reality. "You cannot be serious," he said, his voice stripped of all humor. Reginald, blissfully impervious to the weight of the moment, gave the spoon an experimental twirl. It caught the morning light with a dull glint, utterly failing to look menacing. "Deadly serious," he replied, with the tone of a man who had never once been deadly serious in his life. A murmur rippled through the crowd, building like the first tremors of an earthquake. Near the front, a portly merchant in a fur-trimmed cloak turned to his companion. "Is this part of the entertainment?" he whispered, already calculating how much he could charge for retelling the story later. His companion, a gaunt-faced knight who had seen actual combat, simply pinched the bridge of his nose. From the back of the crowd, a high-pitched giggle erupted, a scullery maid who immediately clapped her hands over her mouth. The sound seemed to break the spell. A wave of reactions crashed over the tourney fields. Gasps of scandalized nobility, guffaws from the peasantry, and a few scattered cheers from those who had bet on the duel ending in farce rather than bloodshed. Lady Eleanor of Westmarch, a woman whose reputation for icy dignity was matched only by her ability to wither men with a single glance, fanned herself vigorously. "This," she declared, "is the most undignified spectacle I have ever witnessed." She did not, however, look away. Beside her, her nephew, a young squire who had not yet learned the value of silence, leaned forward eagerly. "Do you think he'll try to scoop Lord Cedric's eyes out?" Lady Eleanor's fan snapped shut with a sound like a crossbow firing. On the field, Cedric had regained enough composure to look thoroughly offended. "This is a duel of honor," he hissed. "Not some tavern brawl where you threaten a man with cutlery." Reginald blinked. "Ah, right. Honor." He cleared his throat and adjusted his grip on the spoon, attempting a formal duelist stance. The effect was ruined when his foot slipped on a patch of mud, nearly sending him face first into the dirt. The crowd's reaction was immediate and merciless. A chorus of groans, laughter, and, from one particularly unhelpful individual, a slow clap that made Cedric's eye twitch. The nobleman's face darkened to a shade of red typically reserved for overripe tomatoes and men who had just realized they were being mocked by a spoon. "I will not be made a fool of," Cedric snarled. Reginald opened his mouth to reply, then hesitated. There was, he realized, no dignified response to that statement while holding a spoon. Cedric took advantage of the pause to attack. His sword flashed forward with the precision of a man who had trained for this moment his entire life. Reginald, whose training had consisted primarily of dodging thrown bread rolls during feasts, reacted on instinct. He raised the spoon. The resulting clang was not the resonant ring of steel on steel, but the dull, pathetic thunk of metal on cheap tin. The spoon bent. The crowd gasped again, this time with the horrified delight of people witnessing a disaster they would recount for years to come. Reginald stared at his now crooked utensil. "Oh," he said. Cedric, momentarily stunned by the sheer absurdity of the block, hesitated just long enough for Reginald to counterattack, if one could call it that, with a movement that suggested he was attempting to serve soup rather than fight for his life. Reginald swung the spoon in a wide, looping arc. It connected with Cedric's elbow, producing a muffled ibi bonke, and absolutely no damage whatsoever. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. Then chaos erupted. The crowd's reactions fractured into a cacophony of disbelief. The nobility clutched their pearls, or their nearest equivalents. The peasantry howled with laughter. A minstrel in the back frantically began composing what would later become the popular Ballad of the Spoon and the Furious Lord. Cedric, now vibrating with fury, adjusted his grip on his sword. "This sends now," he growled. Reginald, finally sensing that his odds of survival were dwindling faster than ale at a festival, took a step back. "You know," he said conversationally, "I've just remembered I have a prior engagement. Very urgent. Possibly life or death. Would you mind if we rescheduled?" The crowd's roar drowned out whatever Cedric might have said in reply. And so, as history teetered on the brink of recording its most ludicrous duel, Sir Reginald the Unprepared stood his ground, spoon raised, dignity long since abandoned, and prepared to face the consequences of a lifetime of very poor decisions. It was, all things considered, not his most dignified moment, but it would certainly be his most memorable. Chapter 5. An Unexpected Defense. The moment Cedric's blade came whistling toward his head, Sir Reginald experienced what could generously be called a moment of clarity. It was the sort of clarity usually reserved for men dangling from cliffs or realizing they'd just insulted a king's favorite hunting dog. A razor-sharp awareness that death was imminent, and that perhaps, in hindsight, better choices could have been made. Better choices could have been made. Reginald raised the spoon. What happened next defied all laws of combat, probability, and common sense. Cedric's sword struck the curved bowl of the spoon with a resonant ping that echoed across the tourney fields. The impact should have sheared straight through the thin metal. It should have continued unimpeded to remove Reginald's head from his shoulders. Instead, the blade skittered sideways as if it had struck a properly forged buckler, leaving Reginald blinking at his unharmed self while the spoon, now sporting an impressive dent, remained firmly in his grip. A collective gasp rose from the crowd, followed by murmurs that spread like wildfire through the ranks of assembled knights. "Did you see that parry?" whispered a grizzled arms-master to his apprentice. The angle was unorthodox, but technically perfect. The apprentice nodded slowly. He used the spoon's natural concavity to disperse the force. That's actually brilliant." Nearby, a visiting noble from the eastern provinces stroked his beard thoughtfully. "In my country, we have legends of warriors who could turn dinnerware into weapons. The fork masters of Kesh were said to Oh, shut up, Geralt," snapped his wife. On the field, Cedric looked at his sword, then at the spoon, then back at his sword, as if one of them might explain what had just happened. Reginald, equally surprised but significantly quicker to recover, grinned. "Ha!" he declared, giving the spoon an experimental twirl. "Turns out years of fending off my cousins during pudding raids were good for something after all." Cedric's face darkened. He attacked again, this time with a flurry of blows that would have reduced a lesser man to ribbons. What followed was less a duel, and more a bizarre culinary ballet. The ringing clang of steel on tin punctuated by the occasional yelp as Reginald backpedaled furiously. Against all reason, the spoon held. Not well, certainly not gracefully, but it held. When Cedric went high, Reginald somehow managed to angle the spoon to deflect. When Cedric feinted low, Reginald, more through luck than skill, intercepted the blade with the handle. "Impossible," Cedric muttered between clenched teeth, as his fifth consecutive attack was thwarted by what appeared to be a serving utensil. From the sidelines, Gawain the squire was taking furious notes. "Hold spoon like... No, wait. Twisted last moment. Dear gods, is he actually doing this?" The crowd's murmurs grew more intense. A cluster of knights at the front were now arguing in hushed tones. "I tell you, that's the Hollershaw deflection. My old master spoke of it. They say the Duke of Westmire once held off 6 attackers with nothing but a butter knife." "Nonsense. It's clearly based on the principles of concave defense. Note how he's using the bowl to—" Their debate was cut short as Reginald, growing bold, attempted an actual counterattack. With a cry that sounded suspiciously like for second helpings, he lunged forward, spoon raised like a miniature axe. The resulting maneuver would never be taught in any combat academy. The spoon's edge connected with Cedric's armored shoulder with a dull thunk, accomplishing absolutely nothing beyond leaving a small smear of porridge residue on the polished steel. Silence fell. Reginald and Cedric stood frozen, the former realizing the limits of cutlery-based warfare, the latter realizing he was being assaulted by breakfast utensils. "Are you quite done?" Cedric asked with terrifying calm. Reginald considered the question. "Would you believe I was trying to polish your armor?" Cedric's response was a sword stroke so powerful, it not only shattered the spoon into 3 pieces, but sent the bowl section spinning through the air to land with a plop in a merchant's tankard of ale 20 feet away. As Reginald stared at the spoon's handle, now all that remained of his once proud utensil, the crowd erupted into cheers, jeers, and at least one offer to purchase the legendary parrying spoon for an outrageous sum. Cedric leveled his blade at Reginald's throat. "Any last words?" he growled. Reginald looked at the spoon handle, looked at Cedric. Then, with the air of a man who had nothing left to lose, he raised the broken handle like a tiny scepter. "Taste my wrath," he bellowed. and charged. What happened next would later be described by historians as regrettable, hilarious, and why in God's name did no one stop him? Chapter 6. The Psychology of the Spoon. To truly appreciate the cultural significance of Sir Reginald's spoon-wielding heroics, one must first understand the complex medieval relationship with cutlery. In an age when most men measured their worth by the length of their sword and the sharpness of their dagger, the humble spoon occupied a peculiar space between domestic necessity and silent rebellion against martial tradition. The history of spoons stretched back further than recorded time itself. Ancient kings had been buried with golden spoons. Egyptian pharaohs had commissioned jeweled ones. And somewhere in the dank cellars of Rome's greatest villas, there had undoubtedly been a senator who tried to stab Caesar with a particularly sharpened soup spoon. And you're trying to go. Yet by Reginald's era, the spoon had settled into its role as the most unassuming of utensils, reliable, unthreatening, and utterly essential to the consumption of porridge. What few realized was that spoons had always been weapons in their own right. Every peasant mother who'd waved one at a misbehaving child knew this. Every tavern keeper who'd brandished a serving spoon to break up drunken brawls understood its psychological power. There was something uniquely humiliating about being threatened with an implement designed for eating. It suggested that one's opponent didn't even consider the conflict worthy of proper armaments. The annals of warfare contained scattered accounts of spoon-related combat. During the siege of Castle Bracken in 1247, the besieged lord's cook had reportedly held the kitchen against 3 invaders using nothing but a ladle and a well-thrown pot of boiling stew. The chronicles of the White Friars spoke of Brother Anselm, who'd taken a vow of non-violence yet somehow managed to disarm 4 bandits using only a wooden spoon and some creative theology. Even the legendary sword master Aldrich the Red had begun his training as a scullery boy, developing his famous parrying techniques by defending his desserts from kitchen thieves. Yet nowhere in history had a nobleman attempted to fight a formal duel with one. Until now. As the shattered remains of Reginald's spoon clattered to the tourney field ground, an odd silence fell over the crowd. It wasn't the silence of disappointment, nor even of shock, but rather the peculiar quiet that comes when witnesses realize they're observing something unprecedented in human folly. Even Cedric hesitated, his sword still raised, his expression caught between fury and something dangerously close to admiration. "You do realize," Cedric said through gritted teeth, "that you've just made spoon combat a legitimate historical precedent." Reginald, still clutching the jagged remains of his utensil, blinked. "Is that good?" In the crowd, a scribe was already recording the event in meticulous detail. A group of young squires watched with unsettling intensity, their minds clearly racing with possibilities. Somewhere in the back, a merchant was hastily sketching designs for what would later be marketed as the duelist spoon, featuring a reinforced bowl and a handle that could double as a dagger. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Where moments before the spoon had been an object of ridicule, now it shimmered with possibility. The nobility in attendance found themselves glancing at their own dining utensils with new appreciation. The peasantry, realizing they might actually own something of martial value, stood a little taller. Even Lord Cedric II, a dour-faced knight who'd seen battle in 3 kingdoms, found himself staring at his own belt knife with sudden dissatisfaction. Meanwhile, Reginald was coming to a far more pressing realization. He was now completely unarmed against an increasingly irritated opponent. "Now that we've settled the spoon debate," Cedric said, hefting his sword meaningfully, "shall we return to the matter at hand?" Reginald looked at the spoon handle, looked at Cedric. Then, with the air of a man who had just made history and would very much like to live to see it recorded, did the only sensible thing left to him. He turned and ran. The crowd erupted. Cedric bellowed in outrage. And somewhere in the heavens, the patron saint of lost causes and kitchenware smiled down upon the most ridiculous duel in living memory. The spoon had had its moment. Now came the consequences. Chapter 7. The duel takes a culinary turn. Sir Reginald had never been particularly fast on his feet, but the sight of Cedric's sword flashing toward him lent wings to his normally sluggish movements. He dodged behind a market stall, sending a cascade of turnips tumbling across the tourney field. Cedric vaulted over the collapsing produce with surprising agility, his blade carving through the air where Reginald's neck had been moments before. "Your form is atrocious," Reginald panted, scrambling backward. He clutched the remains of his spoon like a holy relic, holding it up as if the shattered utensil might still ward off blows. That last thrust was so overdone it might as well have been my aunt's roast pheasant. Cedric froze mid-lunge, his face a mask of incredulous rage. "What?" "You heard me," Reginald said, gaining confidence as he circled a wooden cart. "Your footwork is about as balanced as a three-legged stool in a tavern brawl. And your grip, saints preserve us, you're strangling that hilt like it owes you money." He tutted loudly, the same disapproving sound his childhood etiquette tutor had made when catching him eating custard directly from the serving dish. The crowd, which had been preparing to cheer Cedric's inevitable victory, now murmured in confusion. A duel was one thing, but witnessing what appeared to be a live critique of swordplay technique delivered by a man armed with half a spoon was something else entirely. Cedric's nostrils flared. "I trained under the finest masters in the kingdom." "Yes, and it shows," Reginald shot back, ducking as Cedric's blade embedded itself in the cart behind him. "All of that expensive education and you still fight like you're trying to chop firewood. Honestly, it's tragic, like watching someone drown a perfectly good cut of beef in gravy." From the sidelines, Lady Eleanor's fan fluttered in shock. Is he really critiquing Lord Cedric's swordsmanship as if it were bad cookery?" Her nephew nodded eagerly. "I think he is." Cedric, now puce with fury, wrenched his sword free and advanced. "You know nothing of combat." "I know enough to recognize a lack of subtlety when I see it," Reginald said. He gestured vaguely with the spoon handle. "Where's the finesse? The je ne sais quoi? A proper duel should be like a well-seasoned stew, layers of complexity, each movement building on the last." The comparison was so absurd that several knights in the audience found themselves nodding along before catching themselves. The portly merchant in the front row leaned to his companion. "He's not wrong about the stew," he whispered. "My wife's cousin makes one with—" "Not now, Geralt," his companion hissed. Reginald, warming to his theme, continued his retreat across the field with the air of a man giving a particularly scathing restaurant review. "And your defensive stance, so rigid, like day-old bread that's been left out in the rain. No flexibility whatsoever." Cedric's next swing was so wild it nearly took out a spectator. The man, a visiting dignitary from a neighboring kingdom, yelped and fell backward into a pile of hay, his hat spinning through the air like a flipped pancake. "Case in point." Reginald crowed. "No control, no restraint. It's like watching a child try to carve a turkey with a battle axe." A strange thing was happening to the crowd. Where moments before they had been firmly on Cedric's side, now pockets of laughter began to erupt. The more Reginald leaned into his culinary metaphors, the more the duel seemed to transform from a matter of life and death into some bizarre theatrical performance. Even Cedric's own second looked like he was fighting a smile. "He's got you there," the man muttered, earning himself a glare that could have curdled milk. Cedric took a deep, shuddering breath. When he spoke, his voice was dangerously calm. "I am going to kill you now." "That's exactly the problem," Reginald exclaimed. "No appreciation for the artistry of violence. You're all brute force, no technique, like eating fine caviar with a shovel." The last comparison seemed to break something in Cedric. With a roar that would have done a bear proud, he charged, his sword a silver blur. Reginald, realizing his critique session was over, turned to flee, only to trip spectacularly over a loose cobblestone. As he sprawled face first in the dirt, the broken spoon skittering from his grasp, Reginald had one final thought before certain doom descended upon him. At least he'd gotten in a few good lines first. The crowd held its breath. And then the castle bells began to toll. Not the usual melodic chimes that marked the hours, but the deep, urgent peals that signaled only one thing: the kingdom was under attack. Cedric's sword stopped inches from Reginald's throat. Both men turned toward the eastern gate, where a plume of smoke was already rising against the dawn sky. "Well," Reginald said after a moment, "this is awkward." The duel, it seemed, would have to wait. Chapter 8. A Knight's Most Unusual Legend. The kingdom had no shortage of legendary warriors, men whose names were whispered with reverence in taverns, and whose deeds were etched into the stained glass of great halls. There was Sir Garrick the Unyielding, who had supposedly held a bridge against 100 foes. There was Lady Brenna of the Dawn, whose blade was said to glow with the first light of morning. And then there was Sir Reginald the Unprepared, who had fought with a spoon. By the time the castle bells finished tolling the alarm and the tourney fields emptied to address whatever crisis loomed at the eastern gate, the story was already mutating. The first version was simple enough. A nobleman had brought a spoon to a duel and somehow survived. But stories, like bad fish left in the sun, have a way of developing their own peculiar flavor with time. By evening, the tale had spread to the outer villages. A traveling minstrel, sensing an opportunity for a memorable ballad, added several embellishments before sundown. In his version, the spoon had been forged from the melted crown of a defeated sorcerer king, its humble appearance belying its terrible power. The crowd at the Pig and Whistle Inn drank this up along with their ale, and by closing time, half the patrons were convinced they'd witnessed the event themselves. The next morning, a merchant caravan carried the story 2 towns over, where it grew more elaborate in the telling. Now the spoon could deflect arrows. Now it had once belonged to St. Anselm the Nourisher, patron of kitchens and desperate last stands. By the time the rumor reached the coastal cities, the spoon had allegedly been blessed by a dying dragon and could reportedly turn water into wine, though this last detail may have been added by a particularly thirsty sailor. Back at the castle, Reginald remained blissfully unaware that he was becoming a folk hero. While the kingdom prepared for possible invasion, he found himself suddenly popular in entirely new circles. The castle's kitchen staff treated him with reverence, presenting him with an ornately carved wooden spoon for your next duel, my lord. The master-at-arms, who had previously dismissed Reginald as hopeless, now studied him with narrowed eyes, as if trying to discern some hidden martial wisdom in his incompetence. Even Lord Cedric found his reputation altered by association. Where once he had been feared as a ruthless duelist, now whispers followed him about how he'd been bested, or at least delayed, by a man with cutlery. This did not improve his temper. The most surprising development came when a delegation of monks from the Order of St. Wilfrid the Well-Fed arrived at the castle gates, requesting an audience with the blessed spoon-wielder. Their order, dedicated to the spiritual aspects of nourishment, had apparently received visions of a warrior who would defend the meek with the tools of sustenance. Reginald, when finally cornered by the abbot in the castle gardens, blinked in confusion. "You think I'm some sort of holy spoon fighter?" The abbot, a man whose girth suggested he took his order's mission seriously, nodded solemnly. "The signs are undeniable. The way you wielded that humble utensil against tyranny, it was nothing short of miraculous." "I was mostly trying not to die," Reginald admitted. "Ah." The abbot's eyes lit up. The humility of the truly chosen. By week's end, the legend had grown legs and begun sprinting in directions even the most creative minstrel couldn't have predicted. A troupe of actors in the capital performed a comedic retelling where the spoon grew to gigantic proportions during the duel. A hedge knight from the borderlands arrived at court claiming to be Reginald's long-lost spoon-fighting instructor. The castle blacksmith, sensing opportunity, began producing dueling spoons with reinforced handles and decorative guards, selling out their first batch within hours. Perhaps most alarmingly, several prominent nobles began studying tableware with newfound interest. Lady Ermintrude of Highgard reportedly hosted an entire banquet where guests sparred with soup ladles between courses, though this ended prematurely when someone lost an eye to a particularly aggressive serving of consommé. As for Reginald himself, he found the whole situation increasingly surreal. Wherever he went, servants stared in awe. Children begged him to demonstrate his spoon techniques. Even the king, when receiving reports of the possible invasion, had paused to ask, with poorly concealed curiosity, "So this spoon business?" Only Gawain, ever the voice of reason, seemed immune to the growing mythology. "You do realize," he muttered as they prepared to ride out and assess the eastern threat, "that if we survive whatever's coming, you'll never live this down." Reginald adjusted his ill-fitting armor and sighed. "At this point, I'm just hoping to die in battle with actual weapons. It would be less embarrassing." Little did he know that history had other plans. The legend of the Spoon Knight had taken root, and like any good story, it would prove far harder to kill than any mere man. Chapter 9. The Aftermath of Infamy. Sir Reginald had always imagined his path to fame would involve some grand feat of arms, perhaps single-handedly defending a bridge against impossible odds, or rescuing a fair maiden from a fire-breathing dragon while composing a particularly moving sonnet mid-combat. Instead, his notoriety came via cutlery. The first sign that his life had irrevocably changed came when he entered the castle kitchens for a midnight snack, a long-standing habit that had earned him both the affection of the staff and several mild digestive complaints, only to find the scullery boys lined up in perfect formation, wooden spoons at their sides like miniature swords. The head cook, a woman who normally greeted him with a rolling pin and threats, now bowed deeply and presented him with a ceremonial soup ladle crossed over a butcher's cleaver. "We've taken the liberty," she announced, "of naming you honorary master of the kitchen defenses." Reginald stared at the ladle. "I don't know what that means." "It means," said the youngest kitchen maid, eyes shining with hero worship, "you're one of us now." This proved to be only the beginning. The castle children took to staging mock duels in the courtyard, shrieking with laughter as they battered each other with utensils pilfered from the dining hall. A group of pages formed a secret society called the Order of the Silver Spoon, complete with absurdly elaborate initiation rites involving pudding and blindfolds. Even the castle cat seemed to regard Reginald differently, watching him with a mixture of respect and wariness, as if expecting him to produce cutlery at any moment. The nobility's reaction was less heartwarming. At court, Reginald became the subject of endless japes and veiled insults. Lord Montague, a man whose idea of wit was about as sharp as a butter knife, took to greeting him with exaggerated flourishes and inquiries about his preferred blade length at dinner. Lady Isolde, his stepmother, alternated between icy disdain and terrifying enthusiasm, once cornering him to suggest he leverage his newfound fame by marrying some merchant's daughter who collected antique servingware. Only Cedric refused to acknowledge the absurdity. He stalked the castle halls like a storm cloud, his usual retinue of sycophants trailing behind him, all pointedly not mentioning spoons. When their paths crossed, which happened with unfortunate frequency in a castle with only 3 working staircases, Cedric would fix Reginald with a glare that could have curdled milk at 20 paces. "You've made a mockery of knighthood," he hissed once, blocking Reginald's path to the privy. Reginald, who had been holding his bladder for the better part of an hour, lacked the patience for this conversation. "If knighthood can be undone by a spoon," he replied, "perhaps it wasn't very sturdy to begin with." Cedric's subsequent outburst was impressive enough that two passing maids immediately began taking bets on when the duel would resume. The most unexpected consequence came from the kingdom's artisans. Within a fortnight, the marketplace overflowed with Spoon Knight merchandise. There were commemorative spoons, ordinary spoons with Reginald's face crudely etched into the bowl, Spoon Knight dolls, which looked nothing like him, but came with delightfully bendable arms, and even a board game called Defend the Pudding Twad. Pudding, where players took turns fending off invading nobles with various kitchen implements. A particularly enterprising metalsmith debuted a line of duel-ready cutlery featuring reinforced handles and decorative crossguards. These sold out immediately, though reports soon surfaced of injuries sustained during overly enthusiastic dinner-table sparring. The kingdom's physicians began lobbying for a ban on recreational utensil combat. Through it all, Reginald vacillated between amusement and existential dread. The attention was flattering in its way, but also deeply confusing. He hadn't meant to become a folk hero. He hadn't even meant to survive the duel. Yet here he was, dodging poets who wanted to compose epics about his culinary valor, and fending off marriage proposals from eccentric aristocrats who believed cutlery mastery indicated strong bloodlines. The final straw came when he received an invitation to judge the kingdom's annual cooking competition. "It's an honor," Gawain insisted as Reginald stared at the gilt-edged parchment in horror. "It's a humiliation," Reginald groaned. "I don't know the first thing about cooking." "Neither do half the judges," Gawain said cheerfully. "Last year's winner was a pie that gave 3 people food poisoning, remember?" Reginald seriously considered fleeing to a monastery, preferably one with very strict rules about silence and no cutlery-based hero worship. But as he stood on the competition's makeshift stage days later, wooden spoon in hand, the organizers had insisted, watching a sea of eager faces hang on his every word, a strange realization dawned. For the first time in his life, people were paying attention to Sir Reginald the Unprepared, not because of his family name or his social blunders, but because of something he'd done, even if that something was wielding a spoon like an absolute lunatic. The thought was oddly comforting. Then a contestant presented him with a tribute dish, a towering meat sculpture shaped like a spoon, and the moment passed. Some legends, it seemed, came with side dishes. Chapter 10. A Spoonful of Redemption. The summons arrived on a crisp autumn morning, delivered by a stone-faced herald who looked as though he'd rather be announcing literally anything else. Lord Cedric of Blackmoor, the scroll declared, demanded satisfaction. The interrupted duel would be concluded at last, 1 week hence, at high noon, upon the very same tourney fields where this absurd saga had begun. The kingdom erupted. Betting stalls sprang up overnight, odds shifting wildly as rumors spread. Some said Cedric had spent the last months training with a legendary sword master in the mountains. Others whispered that Reginald had been secretly forging a spoon of mythic proportions, its bowl wide enough to deflect cannon fire. The castle kitchens reported a sudden shortage of utensils, as enterprising spectators prepared to hurl their own spoons in tribute, should the moment call for it. Reginald, for his part, handled the news with his usual grace, which is to say he tripped over his own feet while reading the missive and had to be extricated from a tapestry. "You could refuse," Gawain suggested, untangling his lord from the embroidered hunting scene, "and live out my days as a coward who ran from a spoon fight." Reginald sighed. "No, this ends properly, with dignity." Gawain eyed the spoon-shaped bread roll Reginald had been eating. Bit late for that. The week passed in a blur of preparation. Cedric, ever the traditionalist, drilled with his blade from dawn till dusk, his strikes growing sharper, his footwork more precise. Reginald, true to form, spent his time in the kitchens, not practicing swordplay, but perfecting his aim, specifically his ability to hurl a spoon across a room with startling accuracy. The Kinstaff, now his fervent supporters, cheered every time he struck a hanging pot, groaned when he missed, and offered tactical advice based entirely on their experience with airborne crockery. The day of the duel dawned clear and bright, as if the weather itself had decided to be a cheerful spectator. The tourney fields were packed to bursting, the crowd a sea of eager faces, and, Reginald noted with some alarm, an alarming number of people clutching spoons of their own. At the center stood Cedric, resplendent in newly polished armor, his sword resting against his shoulder like an executioner savoring the moment. Reginald, for once, was prepared. He wore proper armor. He carried a sword, not his finest, admittedly, but one that at least resembled a weapon rather than a dining implement. And tucked discreetly into his belt, hidden from view, was a single, unassuming spoon. The herald announced the combatants. The crowd roared. Cedric sneered. Finally, he spat. "You've brought a real weapon." Reginald drew his sword with a flourish. "And yet," he mused, "I can't help but feel something's missing." Cedric attacked without ceremony, his blade a silver streak. Reginald parried, awkwardly, but with enough force to avoid immediate dismemberment. The crowd gasped as steel clashed, the duelists circling, testing, probing for weakness. To everyone's surprise, Reginald held his own. Months of being the kingdom's laughingstock had given him something unexpected. No one had bothered to train against his particular style of haphazard swordsmanship. His blocks were unorthodox, his counters unpredictable. Even Cedric seemed momentarily thrown when Reginald attempted a maneuver that looked suspiciously like he was trying to serve soup mid-swing. Still, skill eventually told. Cedric's blows came faster, harder, driving Reginald back step by step. The crowd's cheers grew nervous. The Spoon Knight's legend, it seemed, was about to end in perfectly ordinary defeat. Then Reginald's heel caught on a loose stone. As he stumbled, Cedric lunged for the killing strike, only to freeze when something small and metallic pinged off his helmet with a sound like a very disappointed bell. The spoon clattered to the ground between them. Cedric stared at it. The crowd fell utterly silent. Reginald didn't hesitate. While Cedric was distracted by the spoon, by the sheer audacity, by the universe's apparent determination to make him a punchline, he swung. The flat of his blade connected with Cedric's temple with a satisfying bethunking. The nobleman swayed for a moment, his eyes crossing, before collapsing face first into the dirt. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, the explosion of noise was deafening. The crowd surged forward, cheering, laughing, chanting Spoon Knight with the fervor of people who had just witnessed something gloriously stupid. Kitchen staff wept with pride. Children threw their own spoons into the air like celebratory confetti. Even the king, watching from the royal pavilion, was seen dabbing his eyes with a handkerchief, though this may have been due to the onion tart he had been eating. Reginald, breathing hard, looked down at Cedric's prone form, then at the spoon lying innocently in the dust. He bent, picked it up, and held it aloft like a trophy. The crowd lost its collective mind. Later, after Cedric had been revived, and subsequently locked himself in his chambers to sulk, after the minstrels had composed no fewer than 5 new ballads, including the instant classic "I the Spoon" that won the day, and after the castle blacksmith had received 3 dozen orders for tactical throwing spoons, Reginald found himself sitting in the kitchens once more, surrounded by his unlikely allies. "So," the head cook said, sliding a tankard of ale his way, "what now, hero?" Reginald turned the spoon over in his hands, studying its dented bowl, its worn handle, the humble utensil that had, against all odds, carved his name into history. He grinned. "Now," he said, "we see what else a spoon can do." And somewhere in the heavens, the patron saints of lost causes, kitchenware, and profoundly confused nobility smiled down upon the most ridiculous night the realm had ever known. Into